Hey friends, and welcome back to another episode of Socialites Podcast with me, Gustav Hultgren, as your host. I've just finished an interview with Alex Frishberg, the famous lawyer and expat here in Kyiv, and this was an interesting conversation, I can tell you. Alex shares with us a lot about his insights as to what it was living here in the 90s, how business was done back in those days and how it's changed into what it is today, how the city in itself and the society has changed, and of course Alex also shared quite some interesting views on the investment climate and the agricultural industry in specific. As always, please remember to go into socialite.nu and check for our previous podcasts. You can also, of course, subscribe to our podcast through, for example, iTunes or through YouTube, where we have a channel, youtube.com/socialite.nu. But as I said, you can find all of this information on our webpage, www.socialite.nu. That's all for me. Here we come, the interview with Alex Frishberg. So I'm sitting here together with Alex Frishberg, somewhat of a legal legend in Kyiv. Been here for a very long time, but I think thank you first of all for taking the time to sit with us today. Alex, maybe if you could start off by telling the audience who you are and how you ended up where you are today.
Okay, well, I was born originally in Kyiv, Ukraine, and my family immigrated to America when I was 11 years old. That was in the mid-70s. And I went through all the law school there and went to work in Washington, D.C. for a big law firm there. And then in 1991, the old Soviet Union cracked up into a bunch of different pieces. And I said to my law firm's partners, send me to Kyiv because I can open up your branch there. And you would have a monopoly for a few years, capturing everybody who came on the ground, all the investors. To which they replied that they didn't think that this logjam in the Soviet Union was ever going to end. And for me to go work on intellectual property issues. And so I quit and I came back to Kyiv in October. There was a coup, a revolution here in August of 91. And 2 months later, I was in Kyiv to set up my own practice. And there was nobody here at that time. But half a year later, sure enough, everybody came flooding into Ukraine, all the investors, all the embassies. And I was the only English-speaking lawyer, foreign English-speaking lawyer, for the entire territory of Ukraine, which is a country the size of France. So naturally, all of them or most of them became my clients. And at that time, I was 27, 28 years old, and I've never seen anything like that before or after, because those were the boomtown years when the country was just forming. So this is kind of how I came here and started up my practice.
So what type of business was in demand during these times?
At that time, the biggest things were joint ventures. Companies would do joint ventures with state-owned enterprises, which is state property fund in Ukraine. Then came privatization, when companies would buy out state-owned assets. So with joint ventures, we would do all the documents, we would negotiate the transaction, we would register everything, even with state-owned enterprises. And we, of course, would do due diligence on what the assets were and things like that. And when privatization came, we would do due diligence for state property fund on the factories that they were selling. And then after these factories would go into private hands, they would be sometimes resold. So we would naturally do due diligence on them in the secondary market. And so we were doing basically M&A deals at that time. And whenever you register a company, you also have need for to hire staff, to fire staff, all the peripheral work that goes in that. And that's basically was our bread and butter.
I know that you've written a couple of books, and we can talk a little bit about this. Like the years during the 90s here, and not only in Ukraine, but also all over the former Soviet Union, has some kind of mystique to it. Can you tell us what your impressions are about these years?
Yeah, they were actually very turbulent years, because that's like going back to Chicago in 1930s in America. At that time, we had people called racketeers, which is basically bandits. And a lot of them, what they were old sportsmen, athletes, who stopped receiving funding from the government. And what athletes used to do is organize themselves in groups and go to businessmen to collect money at the end of the month, protection money, protection rackets. We had people who would basically thug-related takeovers. So it was a very interesting time to live, kind of dangerous too. But there was complete, I would say, lawlessness, because tax inspection at that time never collected any taxes. Bandits were prospering, so you always had to have some sort of protection or somebody you could call upon in case something happened to you. And in fact, it happened to me. I had people come to kill me 2 times. The first time, they were drug addicts. They used heroin. And I opened up a business, so they saw a sign on the door, and they thought they could come and collect money from me. That didn't work out too well for them. But then the second time was actually organized crime. They didn't come to collect money from me. What I didn't know is I was actually going in a court of law against them. There was one gentleman who stole $300,000 worth of stuff from a warehouse from my client, a foreign company. And so my job was to fire him. He used to work as an accountant. And what I didn't know is when I was firing him, that he was also an accountant for the local mob. So we were winning for about 6 months. We went to court and we were winning. And then he sent people to me on Friday afternoon to say the following: lightnings strike, cars have accidents, you have a wife. Think about that and give us an answer on Monday, please. And so they gave me their business card with their phone numbers because they weren't afraid of anything. And I couldn't call the police because police at that time were on the take. They would protect people like him. So it would do no good. It would just make them angrier if I went to ask for protection. So I spent all weekend looking for protection, any kind of protection at all, because I couldn't say yes to them. Otherwise, they would take over my business. And I couldn't say no to them because lightnings strike. Cars have accidents. And at that time, I did have a wife. And I was offered all kinds of protection. One was athletes. And somebody else said, well, that's stupid. I mean, if you get athletes, they train together, they're friends. If they know that you got no protection, your protectors will come to collect money from you at the end of the week. And the other guy says, well, take Amon and Birkut. Those are the guys with shields and helmets who beat up grandmothers and students at protests, massive organizations. So the third guy says, yeah, but they're bullies. They put on helmets and pads and sticks and gear to beat up grandmothers. They don't take bullets for you. They run away from bullets. You should take these guys. And so finally, I was introduced to a guy from Alpha Unit, which is the anti-terrorist unit of the KGB. And he was security for one of the ministers. And the minister lent him to me on a one-time basis with a promise that he wouldn't come and shake me down afterwards, which is a very important promise to have from any protection. And so he went to speak on my behalf, and they immediately left me alone. And from that moment, the local racketeers thought that I was always under the protection of the Alpha Unit. And I never really was. It was just a one-time deal. But then he and I became good friends. And then if my clients got into trouble with bandits or racket, then I could always offer him as a subcontractor to solve their problems. So what came out to be very strange is that this nice, white, fluffy bunny rabbit of a lawyer from Washington, D.C. started to be able to offer protection to clients, something I knew nothing about before I came into Ukraine. And those times actually were so fascinating because so much happened on a daily basis that you wouldn't know if you lived in America or any civilized country. That I captured it. I started writing a journal. And then I had some time, so I made this journal into a book, a novel, which is called The Steel Barons. And basically it's about how to become a billionaire in less than 1 year. It's about real life in Kyiv in 1990s, because a lot of people actually became multi-millionaires in a very short amount of time.
Having lived here for quite a while myself, I mean, I've read the book and I recognize quite a lot of the characters in the book, so to say. But is the story a true story?
Well, almost everything in there is true. I mean, it didn't actually happen all to me. So the beginning didn't happen to me and the ending didn't happen to me. I never became a multi-billionaire. But day-to-day life in between, that's basically what I've went through, and it happened to me and most of my friends. So the stories themselves are pretty real.
It's a fascinating story, and it's good reading. I can only recommend the book for someone who has attachment to the country. So what happened then to all of these racketeers? Did they just disappear, or did they move on in life, or...?
Yes, both. They both disappeared and moved on in life, because what happened in the 1994, when President Kuchma came to power, he sent these gray-hair emissary KGB guys to all the racket families in Kyiv neighborhoods to say the following, that we're trying to switch the Ukrainian economy from the Sicilian path that it's currently taking onto a more civilized path. And your activities are incompatible with our plans. So please stop all your strong-arming, stop all the thuggery, and then you can live and keep all the money that you made. If for some reason you could not stop your activities, we strongly recommend you leave the country. A lot of the bandits did leave the country. A lot of them went to Israel because they had no extradition treaty. Some of them went to Los Angeles, and I understand their offices got firebombed, so they moved back to Israel. Some of them went to New York. The other ones stayed in Kyiv, and they didn't know what else to do other than continue strong-arming activities. And then they all went to prison. And in prison, somehow, mysteriously, most, if not all of them, died. Some came out alive, but they were no longer the same men. So the legal system broke all the bandits. A lot of the bandits who remained here stopped their strong-arming, basically muscling activities, and they went into white-collar crime, pyramid schemes, trust funds, investment funds, buying out privatization certificates from people, investing into their own. So they made a lot of money opening up banks, for instance, which later would just take all the people's money and disappear. So that was white-collar crime. A year later, even white-collar crime was kind of frowned upon and prohibited by the government. And as such, as of 95, 96, Ukraine doesn't really have any more organized crime. It was all wiped out in the mid-90s by the government, very efficiently, by the way.
I tend to get the question myself from a lot of friends of mine when I tell them that I live in Ukraine, that, oh, isn't it dangerous? What about the mafia? I typically always say that there is no real mafia, rather than these days as a business owner or entrepreneur, the problems that you will have is typically more with government entities. Do you think there was a case that the government actually brought this business under their own wing, so to say?
I think that at a certain point, all the thugs and racketeers, the ones who are still alive and actually successful today, they all realize that they need to become government, because otherwise government will obliterate them. So a lot of people actually who used to be in kind of semi-criminal world have legitimized themselves by becoming Ukrainian parliament members working very efficiently in the government. That actually today, these days, is a problem, because now you have raiding in Ukraine. Raiding is a concept which is unheard of anymore in America or in civilized countries. It involves several components where you want to take over your competitors or target's factory, for instance. So all you need to do is just pay the judge to issue a wrong decision. And based on that decision, you can take over the company, the factory. You can come in there, take over the books, the seals, and by the time the person appeals your decision and goes through the court system, the factory will be yours or will be sold off already. So if you look up Ukraine on Google and raiding, it's actually becoming a big problem because it's perpetuated by people within the government, not bandits.
Because to my understanding, in Russia, the government has kind of reined in on the raiding situation, and there it's improved quite a lot for business owners. Whereas here, to my understanding, it hasn't really changed that much. They've done some attempts to control it. What would you do as a business owner if you end up in this type of situation?
To be honest with you, I don't even know. There's different techniques that you could use to a different degree of efficiency. You can hire companies to do anti-raiding for you. You can go in courts and appeal. But it really depends here who goes against you. Because if the person who sits inside the government on a high level goes against you, the courts are basically in their favor. And that's a big problem in Ukraine. That's why a lot of people don't trust in setting up big operations anymore, at least for the time being.
And do you see this as a massive effect on foreign direct investment then?
Yeah, I see this as a massive effect. The drop-off in the foreign direct investment in Ukraine is due to several reasons. One of them is in their own home countries. They have their own financial problems. So nobody's overflooding with money to be able to spend it elsewhere. People are much more careful than they used to be in the 90s. Second, the euphoria about Ukraine being the new open market territory, as it was in the 90s, is long gone. Ukraine is not a new market territory. People here do protect their own markets. And last but not least, although there is a higher return on your investment here, much higher, there's also much higher risk. Because what if you now start facing problems with companies, if your business is successful, who want to take it over? And you're now being sued left and right, and tax inspection keeps coming to you, harassing. So those are actually things that you have to consider when you come in here, because it is a risky environment, at least at this stage.
Do you think this is something that is likely to change if Ukraine would sign the trade agreement with the European Union?
Yes, I do. I think that signing the agreement, which I think is coming up in November, will make a huge impact, because now Ukraine is going to have to comply with the normal rules, what I would consider to be normal rules of EU.
But potentially it would take a whole generation shift of judges and parliamentarians in that case in order to sort of flush out the old and bring in the new? Or do you think that they have a chance to actually stop this overnight?
No, there's no way you can stop any of this overnight. In this book that I wrote, The Steel Barons, at the very end, I tried to make this point, which is if you don't turn this country to the right railroad track, meaning no corruption, complete transparency, free market economy, then you should do it now, because there comes a point sooner or later when it's just simply too late. And so right now, in my opinion, to reverse corruption that I see going on, it will take more than a few years. But at least now with the EU agreement, you'll have a chance to go complain somewhere, and you'll bring it to people's attention, so at least there'll be some pressure to change A, B, or C. And right now, this mechanism doesn't exist.
And what do you see as the alternative? I mean, should Ukraine not sign with the EU and either stand on its own feet or swing the Russia way?
Ukraine should definitely not swing the Russia way because it's a dangerous way. Everybody knows what Russia is capable of doing. For instance, poisoning different people, including government's leaders. But going to EU, it means compliance with EU directives, which is with transparency, and this country is simply not prepared to do it right away. Standing on its own 2 feet, Ukraine's been standing on its own so-called 2 feet for the last 1 or 2 years, and here are the results. Most of the country would like to leave the country, would like to immigrate somewhere. The business is falling off, there's no foreign investment. So this is independence. By far the best thing that could happen for Ukraine would be to join EU, but EU probably would not take Ukraine as it is.
I'm not so sure that the EU would be able to afford taking in Ukraine as a member, actually.
Precisely.
Coming back to foreign direct investment, as you mentioned, in your capacity as a lawyer here in town, do you see a lot of activity? Is there a lot of companies looking at Ukraine now, or is it?
No. And I'm very sorry to say this, but what I'm seeing is there's not much foreign investment coming in. Whatever investment is in Ukraine is either holding down the fort or leaving. A lot of companies are leaving, wrapping up their transactions here for various reasons. But no, I do not see much new foreign investment or activities in Ukraine.
And what about farming, for example? We hear quite a lot of success stories out of there, and also in renewable energy that there's quite a lot of activity.
I'm not so sure about that either, because farming here is basically a house of cards. The basic tools, you have your rich land and you have your harvests. That's all in place. But the way foreigners set up their operations is you cannot own agricultural land in Ukraine. There's a moratorium on ownership. So they have all these huge swaths of land, hundreds of thousands of hectares, based on lease agreements. These lease agreements expire sometimes. Sometimes people who own these lands, who lease it to them, die. And then how do you extend that one? There's going to be also lifting of the moratorium on land, probably sometime next year. And then there's different laws that I read, which are kind of horrific for those leaseholders, because they have to re-register every single lease agreement with the state registry, which houses 2 or 3 different people. How do these hundreds of thousands of lease agreements get a number assigned to them? Because without this number, they'll be null and void. The second condition that I read, and this is all changing because it's got many different drafts of the same law being introduced, but with each draft, they're getting worse and worse. One of the conditions was that I read that you first, before you can sell your land to anybody, you have to offer it to the government first at the official value, which means that there's a block on how do you offer it and to whom you offer it, and you have to offer it to the government and pennies on the dollar, and nobody's really going to go for it. They're going to hold on to the land. Last condition, which is that legal entities, whoever they are owned, foreign or local, cannot own more than X amount of hectares, which is also a great restriction. When I talked to my colleagues in the agricultural sphere, they said that the amount of hectares will be allowed for each legal entity is simply insufficient to have a running operation. You need to have more land to make money than what they're being given. So I think that right now, while people are collecting the harvest and selling it, they're making money. Their legal entities are making money. But as soon as this whole lifting of moratorium will hit and re-registrations of the lease agreements, then all these transactions will become much, much more difficult to do because your corporate structure is gone. Your ownership is gone.
But would this be in the interest of the people running these farming operations? I mean, as far as I know, quite a few of these bigger farm operations are at least partly controlled by Ukrainian business interests.
If they're controlled by Ukrainian business interests who work in the government, then they probably will survive. If they are controlled by foreign companies who simply have lease agreements, which they use for these fields, then a lot of these lease agreements may fall through for different reasons. People will refuse to sign them. There will be no registration with the government authorities. People will want to sell the land to somebody else. So that's basically you're building your whole empire on a deck of cards, which can fall down anytime. For now, you're profitable because you have really good land and really good soil, and you have fantastic results that you can sell, the yield. But what if you don't have the rights to use these lands anymore in the future?
You're painting quite a gloomy picture here for the agricultural industry.
We wrote articles about this that you could find on the internet. So that's all set it in there. I analyzed the laws and they don't look beautiful. And this is just information. Whether it's good or bad, it's still information.
I wanted also to ask you a little bit about what other legal developments that you're seeing in the market right now. Is there something that you think sticks out in terms of positive developments in the legal framework?
No, I'll be honest. I don't see that many changes going on. The big positives have kind of already occurred. There was the new tax law and so on and so forth, and that happened. But there's nothing new that I see right now that's changing. Some minor adjustments in twinkling. Local residents cannot pay foreign residents more than X amount of dollars and things like that. It's just tightening on the screws. But there is no major reforms going on.
I've heard some rumors about redrafting of the labor law. Is that something that is on the card still, or is that?
They've been working on this for a very long time. So I just don't see anything major going through, to be honest, until two things happen. First, there'll be a signing of this association agreement, which might have a lot of changes in the customs codes and so on and so forth, because it'll be direct impact. And then there may be something happening probably either before or after the presidential elections to show people that they're actually doing something, which is 2015. So in the next year and a half, 2 years, things could change fundamentally, especially if Ukraine is going to adhere to the EU agreement.
And do you think that Ukraine has a good chance to solve this conundrum with the EU agreement?
I simply don't know how they'll do it. Everybody wants it to happen and everybody needs it to happen for various reasons. But then how do you radically change Ukraine's structure to adhere to the European community's requests? That'll take some time.
Do you find it interesting to be here still, or is it becoming home territory that is maybe not so exciting?
No, I mean, living in Kyiv is actually very interesting because you're still living through history, whereas everywhere else the history has been settled and it's kind of boring and day-to-day activities are predictable. Here you never know what's going to happen next. It's not for the faint of heart, but in Kyiv at least you're still watching this pendulum swing of history. Every year here is condensed. Every year here is like 10 years abroad. So you can actually observe the changes. Kyiv is also interesting because it's a nice town. It's kind of a mini Paris. If you look around in the summertime especially, you have little squares full of trees, fountains, coffee shops, and it's a wonderful place to kind of just hang out and watch the people. And in some ways, you're going back to American 1950s. Because when you come to Ukraine, or especially if you go outside of Kyiv, you will find yourself in 1950s. Same infrastructure, same tractors, same mentality, with people valuing family above all else, for instance. Getting together every night for dinner, welcoming strangers with open heart, just like it was in the 1950s, simple years. So a lot of foreigners, when they come here, they welcome that because it's something that they're missing in their own countries, which have become more robotic and fast-paced.
Do you think the social fabric in Ukraine is changing?
Social fabric here is changing just because there's now, unlike before, so many foreigners and so many locals mixing together. So every night, basically, of the week, you would have 3 or 4 different functions, 3 or 4 different parties. You'd have diplomatic parties, you'd have social parties, you'd have, for instance, Fridays, which is a local group, throws an excellent events. They do it, I think, every other 2 weeks. And when they invite people, like 300-400 people show up. And it's young professionals who speak English, who speak Russian, they mix together. So they're a big success. There's other couple groups like that. So Kyiv basically is still a live and vibrant atmosphere. If you look out to the restaurants, you will see all kinds of restaurants open and full of people, despite the fact that the country is supposed to be broke poor. It's very much a live city.
Yeah, it's really the great anomaly, right? That you see all of this massive impacting wealth around in Kyiv, whereas if you look at any types of statistics, people should, as you say, be dirt poor and really have no money to spend, right?
Yeah, well, that's a funny thing because when people look at Ukraine to evaluate what country it is economically, they look at the macroeconomic indicators, which are always wrong because macroeconomic indicators, official ones, they never take into consideration shadow economy. And shadow economy here is fantastically large. That's why you see so many Mercedeses on the streets, shiny, and Bentleys, and you see all the restaurants full of people and paying cash for prices that are astronomical by anybody's standards. These days, foreigners in Kyiv feel poor in comparison to locals. So the shadow economy cannot be underestimated.
But do you think that there is also a wealth transfer that is in effect in Ukraine? Do you think that it's spreading and coming to the benefit of a larger segment of the community?
I don't know. I wouldn't think so. I think that the people who own the wealth kind of keep it for themselves and use it for themselves, and not only in Ukraine. They travel the world and they spend a lot of money to stay in the poshest London hotels, and some buy property in Monaco. and move their families there. A lot of people buy properties in Miami and move it there, so that the wealth that there is here sticks with the people who actually own it. Not much of it trickles down to the average Ukrainian citizen.
You mentioned that you grew up in the States, although you were born here in Ukraine. Did you grow up in a Ukrainian community in America?
No. Unfortunately, no. We grew up in an immigrant, like a Russian Soviet immigrant community in St. Louis, Missouri. So for like 17 years, I lived there. And the Russian immigrants, they all tend to kind of stick together because they don't know English yet, they don't know anything yet. So it's a very interesting life to live, because there everybody does favors for each other, free. My parents are both doctors, so that the Russians didn't need to go to anywhere else. They would go to my house, my parents would see what's going on, and they could save money. So if you're a butcher, my parents would go to you, the butcher, and you would give us the best cuts of meat at very, very low prices or free, because if it's your store. Same thing. So the Russian community is completely different than American life. And I think that Ukrainian communities abroad that you're referring to, they're more diaspora communities. Diaspora came to America in 1920s and 30s. They are no longer immigrants. They kind of preserve their own nationality by going to churches and by going to summer camps together and so on. But it's a different reality than being an immigrant, when you just came over and you're poor and you have nothing and you have to struggle and make everything, or you fail.
It's an interesting point with regards to the diaspora, because you always hear a lot of comments from the diaspora, particularly in North America and Canada specifically. Do you think that they have some real influence in Ukraine? Or is it just a bunch of old people living abroad that have, as you say, a distorted view of reality here in Ukraine?
My view is that the Ukrainian diaspora abroad, particularly in Canada and America, they've been living with the ideology for forever. Grandparents passed it on to parents, who passed it on to their children, that Ukraine must be independent, that everybody must speak Ukrainian only. When they come to Ukraine, that's the viewpoint that they always propagate. I don't see that much of direct investment from those people, but they do come here and they do try to be good to Ukraine by trying to put Ukraine on the right course ideologically. And so far, that's been their influence here.
So it's more social support.
Social, intellectual, and frankly, for instance, I remember when there was a first Ukrainian Congress. I think it was under Kuchma in the early 90s. It was first, and then there was second, and then there was none. And the reason why is because after the first Congress, when all the Ukrainian diaspora came from all over the world into Ukraine, they complained to Kuchma about how bad the country is and what should be done. And they complained in such adamant tones that I think he issued a special edict saying that you could not criticize the president of Ukraine anymore, period. So the second time, they also gathered a Ukrainian World Congress in Ukraine, and it didn't receive very much support from the Ukrainian government because they were afraid they were going to be chastised, criticized, and dictated and told what to do. And then the whole movement petered out, at least in Ukraine. So the Ukrainian diaspora is still a powerful movement abroad, and it does still stick to their ideals. But I'm not sure how much of them are transferred or transferable anymore into Ukraine.
So most of the influence that they have is debate articles and, well, yeah, in their sense, in the way that they come here as visitors during the summers, I guess you see